Okay, we're going to continue our discussion now, talking about psychosocial development in adulthood. And the place that we're going to start off is with Erickson, since he talked about the psychosocial stages of development. And he's also considered to be the first developmental theorist to spend some real time talking about the changes that take place in development. In comparison to Freud, who said, and also Piaget really, who said that these stages of development had reached their final stages by teenagehood. So Erickson he included stages that went beyond adolescence and even early adulthood and covered the rest of the lifespan. So Erickson originally envisioned 8 stages of development, which occur again in sequence from birth through old age, and 3 of his stages cover the years after adolescence. Later in life, of course, Erickson stressed that stages and ages do not occur in a lockstep manner. In other words, it's not as if you pass through one stage and then never have issues that are relevant to that stage anymore. And it's not as if you may not focus on some aspects of a later stage prior to dealing with all the issues that are associated with another stage. So, for instance, jumping into a marriage before you really have a sense of who you are would be one example of this. Because jumping into marriage might be jumping into or deal more relevant to the stage of intimacy versus isolation prior to, again, really knowing who you are and have developed a full sense of identity, which is more relevant to the identity versus role confusion stage or role diffusion. And then the other 2 stages of late life are generativity versus stagnation, which we'll talk about, and integrity versus despair. So, but before we talk about those things, let me just mention briefly Abraham Maslow. He also described 5 stages which occur in sequence, and these are also relevant in terms of development. Movement occurs when people have satisfied their needs at one level and are ready to move on to the next step. It's not quite as tied in with development as Erickson stages, but we could sort of consider some of the top tiers of this stage model as being more relevant to older adults rather than younger adults. And so in his later years, Maslow reassessed his final level, self-actualization, and he suggested another level after that called self-transcendence. So in the traditional model here, we've got Maslow's hierarchy of needs or stages that people pass through. The first being physiological needs. So once physiological needs are met, then he said that we start to be concerned more with safety needs, the need to feel that the world is organized and predictable, for example. They need to feel safe, secure, and stable. And once these needs are met, then we move on to love and belonging, the need to love and be loved, the need to belong and be accepted, and the need to avoid loneliness and alienation. So you can sort of see some similarity here between the third stage in Maslow's hierarchy and the previous stages that we've been talking about with Erickson, for instance, intimacy versus isolation. And then in the fourth stage, success and self-esteem. Here there's a need for self-esteem and achievement, competence and independence, need for recognition and respect from others. This is almost a bit similar to Erickson's stages of perhaps identity in some sense, in the sense of developing one's self-esteem, but perhaps also in terms of generativity, in the sense that the need for recognition and respect from others has to do with doing things that will garner that respect. And then finally, self-actualization, the need to live up to one's fullest and unique potential, which arguably it would be difficult to attain prior to perhaps middle adulthood. Now, another thing to keep in mind when we talk about ages and stages of development are that uh, unlike some of the things that we talked about in terms of adolescent development, the beginning of puberty and things like that, a lot of age changes and these stages are really more a product of the social clock rather than our biological clocks. The social clock is a developmental timetable that's based not on biological maturation, but on social norms, which set the stages of life and the behaviors considered appropriate for each of them. Some ages set by the social clock are enacted into law in the form of minimal ages for driving, drinking, voting, getting married, signing a mortgage, and being entitled to retirement benefits. But there's nothing inherently unique about the age of 65 that qualifies somebody for retirement. Just like there's nothing inherent about being age 21 that permits an individual to be able to drink alcohol. Those are really social norms, and of course they differ from one country to the next. But at times they are enacted into law, and so there's a perception that that is the time point at which that sudden change occurs. When we look at personality through adulthood, we find that genes, parental practices, culture, and adult circumstances all contribute to personality. And of these four, genes are probably the most influential, at least according to data that comes from longitudinal studies. Since genes do not change from conception through death, it's not surprising that most studies find substantial continuity in personality. And when we talk about personality, probably the most amount of research has been done on traits, personality traits, and the most popular model for describing personality comes from a model called the Big Five. And the Big Five refers to 5 dimensions on which personality varies. In other words, everybody has these Big Five traits to some extent. But some people are very high in some and very low in others. Other people are very high in all of them. Other people are very low in all of them. And in order to describe personality using the Big Five, you sort of identify where a person falls on each of these 5 dimensions relative to other people. So let's talk a little bit about what these 5 are. First of all, the Big Five traits can be remembered using the helpful acronym OCEAN, OCEAN, which stands for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Now, within these 5 different factors, we'll call them, openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, there are different facets as well. So in other words, under the factor of openness, there are other categories in which or dimensions along a person could be high or low. So the openness trait itself is characterized by one's degree of imaginativeness, curiosity, artisticness, creativeness, and openness to new experiences. Conscientiousness, on the other hand, refers to things like organization, deliberateness, conformity, and self-discipline. Extroversion can be described as things such as being outgoing, assertive, and active. Agreeableness includes things such as being kind, helpful, easygoing, and generous. And neuroticism includes things such as being anxious, moody, self-punishing, and critical. So this is what most of the research on continuity and change in personality has used, is this Big Five model. Now, another thing that is important to consider when we look at how people change over the course of lifespan or how they are has to do with the way that they choose a lifestyle. So in adulthood, people choose their particular social context or ecological niche. In other words, I chose to go into a particular area because it was interesting to me and I was able to do it well. I didn't choose to go into areas that were very difficult for me and I couldn't do very well. So the ecological niche kind of refers to the place for which you're well suited to do well in. Adults they select vocations, they select mates and neighborhoods, and they settle into routines and surroundings. Ages 30 to 50 are really marked by more stability of personality than our other periods of life. In other words, when we say they're marked by more stability, what that means is that between the ages of 30 and 50, you see less change in people's personality than at any other time. That's not to say that people do not change at all. In fact, when we look at changes and stability within adult personality, we find that overall personality is quite stable, but there are minor ups and downs. That is, people tend to become less open. They score lower on the trait of openness. They score higher on the trait of conscientiousness. They score lower on the trait of extroversion. They score higher on the trait of agreeableness, and they score lower on the trait of neuroticism. Okay, so those are just sort of the general trends that you tend to see. Now, the other important factor to keep in mind is that although people may become less open to experience as they get older, what also tends to happen is that because everyone else tends to get a little bit less open to experience, or they score a little bit lower on this trait openness to experience as they get older, that means that wherever I am at age 30 relative to other people will be about the same place as where I am relative to other people at age 60. Because not only did I decrease, but other people had also decreased. So in relative terms, that means that I would still score about equally on the trait of openness. We also see some gender differences in personality. For instance, men tend to be a little higher in extroversion and openness. Women tend to be a bit higher in conscientiousness and agreeableness. And just like with any other sex differences that we talk about, these sex differences may be innate, perhaps related to hormones, or alternatively, they may not be innate. They may be due more to our environment or to our culture. But one thing that we tend to see is gender convergence. This is a tendency for men and women to become more similar as they move through middle age. Let me just make one other point that this is interesting in light of the fact that there's also a greater similarity between males and females in prior to puberty as well. So they go from being much more similar to less similar to being more similar again. Intimacy needs are lifelong. Adults meet their need for social connection through their relationship with relatives, with friends, coworkers, and romantic partners. And one's social convoy is sort of defined as collectively the family members, friends, acquaintances, and even strangers who move through life with an individual. So it's kind of the people that that you're in contact with, and will play some role in shaping your own development. Friends are typically the most crucial members of the social convoy. They're often able to provide practical help and useful advice, particularly when serious problems such as the death of a family member, personal illness, or loss of a job arise. And some a comprehensive research study done by Fingerman et al. Found that friendships tend to improve with age. Friends are typically the most crucial. I'm sorry. I meant to switch slides there. When family bonds are similar to friendship bonds, relatives are mainstays of the social convoy. Physical separation does not necessarily weaken family ties. In fact, relationships between parents and adult children are more likely to deteriorate if they live together. A lot of college students can start to see the beginnings of this start to happen. I know that as an adolescent, I was quite rebellious, a bit out of control. And although I was very close with my parents as a younger child, not so much so during adolescence when I was busy wreaking havoc. When I reached adulthood, and I had moved out of my parents' home, we had strengthened our relationship. So that's sort of the typical way that family relationships change, particularly with the parents. But I saw something similar with my brother as well, where we during childhood, late childhood, early adolescence, we sort of drifted apart a little bit. Weren't particularly close in early adulthood, and then gradually became more close to one another over the years as well. So over the years of adulthood, parents and adult children, they typically increase in closeness, forgiveness, and pride as both generations gain maturity. That's probably particularly so the case for the children, though, since they're typically the ones that are more immature during those times. Now, of course, there are both individual and cultural differences in the types of family bonds that individuals have. And in particular, families differ in a domain called familism. Familism refers to a belief that family members should support one another, sacrificing individual freedom and success, if necessary, in order to preserve family unity. So, this means that parents might expect their children to basically perform more duties for the family. Maybe spend more time caring for younger siblings or doing other things for the family. That's the type of thing that might be characteristic of this sort of thing. Although it also includes things like never going against a family member as well, again, to preserve that family unity. So as I said a couple minutes ago, adult siblings also become mutually supportive in adulthood. Adult siblings help one another cope with children, with marriage, and elderly relatives. Sibling bonds are particularly likely to develop during adulthood among children who grew up in large families with major stressors like extreme poverty or bitter divorce. Family closeness can, however, sometimes be destructive. Some adults wisely keep their distance from their blood relatives, and they may instead become fictive kin in another family. That is, someone who is accepted and treated like a family member. So sometimes you hear people refer to their friends as their brother or their sister because they've become so close that it's like they've joined the family, even though they're not genetically related to one another. And we can see in this graph here the closeness of siblings at different ages. So roughly 2/3 of adolescents between 13 and 16 consider their relationship with siblings to be ambivalent. Not really problematic, but at least ambivalent. Not particularly close, in other words. Although about a third do. By the age of 20 to 29, you see that closer to 60% of siblings consider themselves to be close, with a much smaller proportion to be ambivalent. Although what's also interesting is that you do see a rise in at least based on these U.S. Census Bureau data, you do tend to see a rise in the number of individuals who rate their relationship as problematic with siblings, which is interesting. But by and large, you can see that the overall trend is that more and more individuals rate their relationship with siblings as close, and fewer rate them as ambivalent. In terms of committed partners, adults everywhere seek committed sexual partnerships to help meet their needs for intimacy, as well as to raise children, share resources, and provide care when needed. Less than 15% of U.S. residents marry before age 25, but by age 40, 85% have married. And of course, some will get married after age 40 as well, but a sizable majority of individuals are married by at least age 40. When you compare married people to unmarried people, you find that married people are a little happier, healthier, and richer than never married ones, but not by too much. And there's probably much greater variability between people who are married than there is a difference between people who are married and people who are not married. So contrary to outdated impressions, the empty nest, which is the time when parents are alone again after their children have moved out and launched their own lives, this actually improves a relationship. So, there's a relatively sizable misconception that when children leave the home, that leads to feelings of depression or loneliness between parents, but that's, like I said, not the case. Most long married people stay together because they love and trust each other, not simply because they're stuck. So it actually turns out to be that many parents rate the time when their children have moved out as a more positive time than when children were living with them. It can be difficult to characterize, large groups of individuals, but when we look at the overall trends, this is about what happens with marital happiness over the years. That the first 6 months after weddings, that's the honeymoon period. That's the happiest of all. In the next 6 months to 5 years, happiness dips and divorce is most common. It's the usual time for the birth of the first child. And then in the next 5 to 10 years, happiness pretty much holds steady, but then it dips again in the next 10 to 20 years as children reach puberty, because that's often a stressful time for many parents. From 20 to 30 years after getting married, happiness rises again when children leave the nest. So again, in contrast to the empty nest syndrome. And then from 30 to 50 years, happiness is high and steady, once again, barring serious health problems. Now, of course, adults are affected, for better or for worse, by divorce in ways that they never anticipated. Generally, those in very distressed marriages are happier after a divorce, while those in merely distant marriages, which is most U.S. divorces, are less happy than they thought they would be. In other words, if a marriage has serious problems, people are better off getting a divorce. And if that's not the case, in individuals who are getting divorced because they feel more distant from one another, they tend to think that they'll be happier after the divorce than they actually turn out to be. And this could be for a number of reasons. Divorce reduces income, it severs friendships, and it also weakens family ties. So, the family that you would typically spend time with, in-laws and whatnot, you typically spend less time with them, and that could be certainly a psychosocial stressor for many people. If we look at some of the factors that are predictive of divorce, we see that we can break these factors into 3 different categories: those that occur before marriage, those that occur during a marriage, and those that are more related to the culture itself. So, risk factors that make divorce more likely before marriage include if the parents were divorced, if either partner is under age 21, if the family is opposed to the marriage, if the individuals cohabit before marriage, if previous divorce was present of either one of the partners, and if there's a large discrepancy in things such as age, background, interest, or values. During marriage, the risk factors include things like divergent plans and practices regarding child rearing and childbearing, financial stress or unemployment, substance abuse, communication difficulties, lack of time together, emotional or physical abuse, and relatives who do not support the relationship. And then in terms of the cultural variables that are risk factors for divorce, a culture that has a high divorce rate in their cohort is a risk factor. Having weak religious values, laws that make divorce easier, approval of remarriage, and acceptance of single parenthood. Now, the consequences of divorce can last for decades. Income, family welfare, and self esteem are lower among the formerly married than among people of the same age who are either still married or have always been single. Um, and almost 1 out of 2 marriages ends in divorce in the U.S. Now, keep in mind that just because 1 out of 2 marriages ends in divorce does not mean that 50% of people are likely to get a divorce, because some people will marry, get divorced, and then remarry, and then divorce again. And so you have to take into account the number of times that divorce occurs after remarriage as well. Generativity, according to Erickson, in contrast to stagnation, comes after the intimacy versus isolation conflict stage, when adults are seeking to be productive in a caring way. Adults satisfy their need to be generative in many ways, including creativity, caregiving, and employment. And in terms of caregiving is typically related um, to having children, but it's not necessarily limited to that. Some caregiving involves meeting another person's physical needs, feeding, cleaning, and so on, but much of it has to do with fulfilling another person's psychological needs. And a kinkeeper in a family is a caregiver who takes responsibility for maintaining communication among family members. The chief form of generativity is establishing and guiding the next generation. Every parent is, of course, tested and transformed by the dynamic experience of raising children. Anyone who's a parent can attest to this. Just when an adult thinks that he or she has mastered the art of parenting, the child advances to the next stage, and the adult is required to make major adjustments. Roughly 1/3 of all North American adults become step parents, adoptive parents, or foster parents. Many adopted or foster children remain attached to their birth parents, part of the normal human affection for their caregivers. If children are not attached to anyone, as can happen when they spend years in an institution, for instance, they often become mistrustful of all adults and fearful of becoming too dependent. Step families have become more and more common over the years. The average age of new stepchildren is about 9 years, which means that usually they're strongly connected to their biological parents, as opposed to stepchildren being much younger when they haven't had time to sufficiently bond to their biological parents at that point, at least not on a conscious level. And this average age, it helps the child, but it hinders the step parents. Young stepchildren often get hurt, sick, lost, or disruptive, and teenage children may get pregnant, drunk, or arrested. And certainly these things can be sorts of stress, and the way that step parents and parents handle these issues is going to have a large influence on the type of step family it becomes. Generativity with patient authoritative parenting is needed. In terms of adoption, adoptive parents have several advantages. They're legally connected to their children for life. The biological parents are usually absent, and Typically, those who seek adoption desperately wanted to have that particular child. Strong bonds can develop, especially when the children are adopted as infants. And during adolescence, these bonds may stretch and loosen as some adoptive children become intensely rebellious. Although this may be the case with all children, but this may be particularly problematic at times in those who are adopted. Fewer adults are available to care for elderly family members, and there are more older adults now. So that's had an influence on the generativity since Erickson first formulated the stage model. Siblings' relationships can be strained if a parent becomes frail and needs care. One sibling usually becomes the chief caregiver, and that could be a source of stress for both the one who is the caregiver as well as the one who is not the chief caregiver. The sandwich generation refers to the generation of middle-aged people who are supposedly squeezed by the needs of the younger and older members of their families. In reality, some adults do feel pressured by these obligations, but most are not burdened by them, either because they enjoy fulfilling them or because they choose to take on only some of them or none of them. In terms of employment, this is the other major avenue for generativity. Adults have many psychosocial needs that employment can fulfill. Unemployment is associated with higher rates of child abuse, alcoholism, depression, and many other problems. Even though the average income has doubled, overall happiness within the United States has not risen noticeably in the past 50 years. And the idea, relative deprivation refers to the idea that people compare themselves to others in their group and are satisfied if they are no worse off than the group norm. And this may explain, why we don't see a correlation between average income and overall happiness, because it's not that, money does not really make people happy. Okay, not having money or not having sufficient money to meet one's daily needs is a significant source of stress, and that typically does lead to unhappiness. But once those basic needs are met, you find that money really doesn't play a large role in determining how happy one is, and this can be partially explained by the fact that where we live, we typically live around people of a similar income, and so if we see that we're not worse off than those who are around us, that's what this relative deprivation model suggests, is that that's sort of how we determine our happiness. Work meets generativity needs by allowing people to do some of the following: develop and use their personal skills, express their creative energy, aid and advise coworkers, for instance, as a mentor or a friend, support the education and health of their families, and also to contribute to the community by providing goods or services. And we've talked about extrinsic and intrinsic motivation in the past, and these extrinsic and intrinsic rewards can be applied to work too. The extrinsic rewards of work are the tangible benefits, usually in the form of compensation, such as one's salary, getting health insurance, or having a pension that one receives for doing a job. Intrinsic rewards of work, on the other hand, are the tangible gratifications, job satisfaction, self-esteem, pride, things like that come from within oneself as a result of doing a job. So in other words, if you like your job, relatively independent of the benefits you get for it, that's an intrinsic reward of that particular job. On the other hand, if you only like working a job because it pays you well, or you get some sort of benefit that's tangible, that's more of an extrinsic reward for work. There's greater and greater diversity in the workplace, or there has been a trend toward greater and greater diversity in the United States. Diversity in employees' backgrounds presents a challenge for employees for employers as well as for employees. Not everyone has the same expectations, needs, and desires. And so a mentor who is a skilled and knowledgeable person who advises or guides an inexperienced person is another way that employment can provide a forum for generativity. One recent change that we've seen in the labor market that impedes generativity is an increased frequency of hiring and firing. Between the ages of 25 and 42, the average worker in the United States has 5 separate employers, so there's quite a bit of shifting around there. And older workers find job changes particularly difficult. It's harder to adapt for older workers to new job circumstances. Another recent change in employment patterns is the proliferation of work schedules beyond the traditional 9 to 5, Monday through Friday type of job. And fortunately, some jobs have flex time, which is an arrangement in which work schedules are flexible so that employees can balance personal and occupational responsibilities. Another aspect of employment that's changed drastically over the years is telecommuting, working at home and keeping in touch with the office via computer, telephone, and fax. About 1/3 of all working couples who have young children and non-standard schedules save on childcare by having one parent at home while the other is at work. So in terms of coping with stress, a stressor is any situation, event, experience, or other stimulus that causes a person to feel stressed. And one way that we can sort of assess the effect that stress has is by looking at the allostatic load. And the allostatic load refers to the total combined burden of stress and disease that an individual must cope with. This also explains why some individuals can handle some stressors more so than others because it depends on what one's allostatic load is. At some point, stress can become so great that just about anybody would be adversely affected by additional stressors. But likewise, at some very low level of stress, when our allostatic load is very low, stressors are far less likely to have much of an effect on us. And so some stressors, such as serious illness or unexpected job loss, are major, but others are minor. Yet ongoing hassles, such as traffic on the daily commute or added work of having to raise twins, those can have more cumulative sorts of effects. And these physiological reactions, they take a toll, and past stressors make it more likely that a new stressor will have an impact. As I said, as we get closer to that threshold, as our allostatic load increases, stressors can have a greater effect. Most of us can deal with stress, though, because in part of organ reserve, this is a capacity of human organs to allow the body to cope with unusual stresses. So, for instance, usual stress might be just the amount of oxygen that your lungs need to take in to walk from your home to the subway or to your car. But we can typically run there no problem as well, and that's due to organ reserve. Unfortunately, organ reserve values tend to decrease across the lifespan, and we've talked about some of those things in the previous chapter. So that's one way that we cope. But there are also different coping mechanisms that people have. And some of these coping mechanisms are considered to be problem-focused, meaning that there's a strategy often used by younger adults that deals with stress in which they tackle a stressful issue directly. So the problem focus refers to the fact that you're trying to do something to solve the problem. Emotion-focused coping is a strategy that's more often used by older adults to deal with stress. And in this case, in emotion-focused coping, they tend to change their feelings about the stressor rather than changing the stressor itself. So, for instance, rather than trying to change something, you just try to have a different outlook on it. So if you could just sort of, you know, uh, shrug something off and not let it bother you, even though it's still present, that would be an example of this emotion-focused coping. Uh, Gender also affects how a person responds to stress and thus affects allostatic load. Men are inclined to be problem focused and tend to be more likely to react in a fight or flight type of manner. Women are more emotion focused and likely to tend and befriend. Virtually every study finds that social support is a crucial factor in reducing allostatic load, regardless of whether one is male or female, although males and females do tend to use somewhat different strategies when dealing with those stressors. Yet social support is crucial for everyone.